Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. This has been such an inspirational day today, and my colleagues and I are very excited to be part of this conversation about online learning, representing the libraries. When the pandemic began and higher ed moved to remote learning, it seemed to be automatically assumed by everyone that academic libraries would not follow and that we would remain in our buildings throughout the pandemic. Then a very confusing conversation happened between librarians and university administrators globally, where librarians asked, why do we need to stay in our buildings? And university administrators said, well what are you going to do without the books? And how is anyone going to use the library without actually going to the library? And as librarians, we sort of looked at each other like, what do they think we've been doing over here all these years? It dawned on us at this moment as a profession that even though we had years of experience moving into a hybrid environment and library users, our students and researchers, had been increasingly using our services and accessing our collections remotely, somehow we had made this transition so well and so naturally that nobody had even noticed. It was like the best kept secret in academia. So we eventually did pivot to remote work like the rest of you for the sake of public safety. But once we were there, we found that this was an opportunity to show the world that remote libraries and later hybrid libraries are not only already here, but they're actually a major factor in how we're able to maintain such a strong impact on scholarship and learning and to hold such a central role to the university community in the 21st century. So more about that in a moment, but let me just stop here to introduce myself and my colleagues. We are librarians from Rutgers University, and we represent two aspects of librarianship: user services, which includes reference and instruction, and technical services, which includes metadata and collection development. My name is Melissa Fino, and my role at Rutgers is metadata for special collections and audiovisual materials. I've been at Rutgers for almost 20 years, coming in as a graduate student at the School of Communication and Information, which at the time was still called the School of Communication, Information, and Library Science. And I'm also a graduate student, again, completing my second master's degree this spring in liberal studies at Rutgers Camden, which I've done as a fully online program, making me an online learner. I'm also the co-author of a book, Virtual Technical Services, a Handbook, with my boss, Mary Beth Weber, who is here with me today. Mary Beth is the head of Central Technical Services. She has a BA in Art History and English from Michigan State University and a Master of Library Science from Clarion University in Pennsylvania. Mary Beth has authored numerous books. I've actually lost count of how many at this point, including Virtual Technical Services, a Handbook, and Rethinking Library Technical Services, Redefining Our Profession for the Future. She served as editor of Library Resources and Technical Services, which is one of the leading library science scholarly journals, for 9 years. Mary Beth and I represent the technical services side of things, but on the user services side, we have with us Dr. Naomi Gold and Matt Bridgman. Naomi has a PhD in religious studies from the University of Toronto and has taught both in-person and synchronous online classes in library and information studies. She's worked professionally as a librarian at Samford University, the College of Staten Island, Seton Hall University, and currently at Rutgers Newark. Her professional focus includes developing strategies for effective library instruction, open access publishing, open and affordable textbook and course materials, and library science education. And we also have Matt Bridgman, who is the Information and Education Librarian at the Robert Wood Johnson Library of the Health Sciences in New Brunswick. He's the library liaison to the Ernest Mario School of Pharmacy and the Physician Assistant Program in the School of Health Professions. His specializations include evidence-based medicine, pharmaceutical sciences, open educational resources, and outreach. So we come from all corners of the library world. Getting back to the question, why are we here? What do libraries have to do with online learning? And the answer is a lot. Libraries are built out of more than paper and bricks. Mary Beth will get into this in more detail, but our resources have been moving online for decades. In fact, we've essentially been operating in a hybrid environment for nearly half a century. This shift started back before I was even born. Library catalogs began moving online in the 1970s and 1980s, back when only universities and the military were using the internet. Our technical services operations at Rutgers, where Mary Beth and I work, began centralizing and shifting to remote locations off-site away from library buildings in 1989. Then came the shift to online journals and databases, ebooks, streaming media, and digital libraries. Simultaneously, on the user services side, on Naomi and Matt's side of things, we saw a shift to remote services like virtual reference and online instruction. With the pandemic, the shift to remote librarianship was a necessity, but it was also an opportunity for us to showcase how this hybrid existence has the potential to revolutionize and revitalize academic librarianship. So if you don't mind, I'd just like to ask you to sit back for a moment and think about your research in the past year. I'm not even asking about lockdown, I'm just talking about the past year. And in your mind, mark off every single one of the following things that you've done. So in the past year, have you, I'm going to go through these real fast, visited a library website, searched an online library catalog, searched a database like EBSCO or PubMed, searched worldcat.org, found a library book or other resource through Google, read a dissertation online, viewed an exhibit online, read a peer-reviewed article online, read an ebook, emailed a librarian or library access services, what we call circulation. Have you asked a question over a chat service? Have you visited a library page on Facebook, Instagram, or TikTok? Have you read a tweet posted by a librarian or library worker? Have you viewed an instructional video created by a librarian? Have you attended a Zoom event or a class with a librarian? Or have you attended an online presentation delivered by 4 particularly inspirational and insightful Rutgers librarians who told the funniest jokes ever? Hopefully you're all saying yes to the last one. But if you've answered yes to any of the others, then you've already met us in an online space. And this isn't hello, it's hello again. So I'm going to shift things over now to Mary Beth to speak more about how libraries have changed in the past few decades.
Hi, everyone. As Melissa mentioned, libraries have become increasingly hybrid. If your perception of a library is a place with a bunch of old books, then you might not have gone to a library in a long time. The shift from physical to hybrid and digital started with things like databases, ebooks, e-journals, and of course, streaming media. And the reason for that was that so that we could serve a larger number of users concurrently. And also with the increase in distance programs and asynchronous learning, it was a perfect fit. We also offer RU Core, which is our Rutgers community repository, which has our ETDs and scholarly output, as well as SOAR, which is our scholarly open access repository. And if you work at Rutgers, you're probably familiar with one of those. The emphasis is on what we can provide, not what we own. So we have moved in that direction of providing things to people at their point of need and when they need them. And that includes some of our resources being offered around the clock. Okay, Melissa, you can do next slide, please. Melissa mentioned that she and I work in library technical services, and I'm going to take a few minutes to talk about our operation, which looks like a warehouse. It was constructed in 1989 when books were still a big part of libraries. We have worked remotely since 1989. We provide the infrastructure that makes our services available throughout the university, including to off-site users. We serve all the libraries. We don't serve a particular campus or discipline. We use technology. We've leveraged it to improve internal and cross-campus communication. We've had little or no interaction with the public even before the pandemic. So it didn't matter where we were located as long as we could provide the services that were needed. And we were already ideally positioned to move into the era of the pandemic and afterwards when we found out that hybrid working was successful and would be something that was here to stay. Okay, I think we can do the next slide.
Flexible hybrid schedules have made us much more impactful librarians, but in what way? Next slide, please. as my colleagues have been saying, academic libraries were in a very good, maybe even ideal position to pivot into online service delivery because we've been building up increasingly robust electronic and remote services for many years. So many of the necessary elements and practices were already in place. And I'm going to say a few words about why that's been so. Um, the pressing need for expanding ways to provide services has been the product not only of the communication habits and expectations of what we tend to call traditional students, whom we tend to think of as digital natives in their early 20s, pursuing undergraduate studies full time. But I, especially in a campus such as Rutgers Newark, I increasingly ask myself, what is a traditional student nowadays? Our evolving student body includes veterans, transfer students, students who are working and raising families, and of course, our undergraduates, many or perhaps most of whom, based on a sort of unofficial and scientific surveys I've taken, hold down jobs in the midst of their studies. So the need to meet them outside of a traditional brick and mortar 9 to 5 kind of venue has been developing over time. We've been meeting that over time. And lest we think that our relationships then remain in the remote or virtual environment, I'd like to emphasize it's been my experience and the experience of other colleagues that these remote online interactions frequently translate into in-person ones. And over the past years into one-on-one Zoom interaction. So the closest thing to a face-to-face meeting that one can possibly have without actually being in the room. So real relationships are established. Next slide, please.
Oh, all right, so I'll jump in here. So I'll be talking about the reference services and how they are impacted in this new hybrid environment that we live in. Now, just prior to hopping onto this conference, I forgot that this was not a library-centered conference. I may need to define what reference is and what reference services are. So reference services are basically when a faculty member, researcher, student, or just general curious person comes into the library looking for information, and they come to one of us, either at the front desk or through virtually, to ask the question and get that information they need. And this could be something as simple as finding a book, or doing a systematic literature search, which takes place over a few months or a year. So it's a major component of library services. Now, since this is focusing on our new states as essentially a hybrid library, we have a system that keeps track of all reference interactions. So these are all those questions, all those interactions that we have. So I ran the system to look at what we had from March 13th, March 13th, 2020, which I consider to be the first day of lockdown because that was Friday the 13th, and I believe that has the best poetic justice. So since that date, we have answered, amongst us at the university, 71,380 questions. Now, as I said, these can be almost anything related to the variety of research topics. There are subject specialist librarians who work in particular areas. In my case, it's the health sciences, in pharmaceutical sciences, and evidence-based medicine. Those are the type of questions that I would be answering. So some would be related to business, literature, and such, depending on their area of specialization. Now, previously, before the lockdown, before the complete transition, it was assumed that the primary mode would be in person. Since then, we've now normalized video consultations, which have actually grown our reference interactions and question services through that time. And it has become these greater modes or more modes of interaction that we've ever had, and has increased reference question answering and helping our students and faculty with their research projects. This has in addition led to greater collaboration among campuses. So this is me helping people not just in my immediate area of New Brunswick. I am now more ingrained in the I was more ingrained in the campus environment of RBHS, which includes New Brunswick, Newark, and our fun little off campus down in Blackwood, which is actually on Camden Community College. And that was where a doctorate of physical therapy program was. They're actually moving up now to Newark. But I was able to integrate and just be a part of their instruction. So I would teach classes on how to utilize the resources and help these budding students achieve their goals and help them achieve their degrees. And this sort of normalization of this cross-state, I actually did drive down there once just to see, because I wanted to see the campus. I'm a curious person. And it was like a 2.5-hour drive, but instant when it was on virtual services. And with that, since we have this virtual service without having to worry about traveling or getting to, I don't remember the bad old days where you had to go to a classroom and then figure out how the tech worked. All that stuff is stopped now. So now it can be as simple as clicking a button. We have these special appointment pages now where you can set up an appointment with one of us, select a date and time that works best for you. Or if not, we can also meet outside standard hours if that need be, especially in the health sciences, in which as Naomi, I'm sure, is familiar with, is people who are non-traditional students or working people who the best time is outside standard hours. So we're now better able to serve these people, which traditionally, in the traditional sense, would have been underserved. Next slide. Thank you. So with that, in addition to our reference services, which are short little bursts and little interactions that we have with our faculty and constituents and patrons, however we kind of want to call them, we also provide instruction services. Now, our instruction services are the policy that I think of all the different things because they're very decentralized. So our instruction services involve teaching how to utilize library sources, navigating the library website, and in those specific resources, of which I believe we have 500. We have a lot, again, with each specialization. So we teach sessions depending on the needs of that particular program, students, or the faculty. And these are how to navigate the library resources, doing strategic searching, which is especially important in areas of evidence-based medicine, research best practices, how to navigate these resources, maintain them, and use them for publications. We even have some librarians who specialize in data services and data collection. I know my one colleague, also in the health sciences, was working with programs about the new data sharing plan with NIH, which just went into effect at the end of January. So our goal is really just to help smooth out all this and help smooth out all the rough bumps and ways of going through the research process and navigating the resources at the library. And through the new modes, we're able to do this in a number of different ways that were available prior, but were not utilized until we went into lockdown, and then they became the primary. And now as we shift back to more in-person is still relevant. As you can see in this picture, if you can see, it's just a very tiny picture of me teaching a series of students in a very tiny instruction room at the Robert Wood Johnson Library, which if anyone has the ability to find this little library, which is sort of an appendix. I call it the appendix on the side of the hospital. So we teach, it's defined as a clinical library. So people who are doing their clinical rounds will come in. So we'll get doctors, residents, pharmacy students doing their clinical rounds and classes come in. These are typically smaller classes. They'll come in and we'll help them, or I'll teach instruction on how to find reliable, easy resources for projects or their journal clubs, which is a major thing at the clinical level. So among those modes we can do these in person, or one of the more difficult ones is doing it in hybrid. I don't know who here has tried to do a hybrid class where you have to do virtual and in person. It is possible, but it's a little tricky, and we're still getting to hammering out the details with that. But the fact that we can do it, and we're more comfortable doing it than we've ever been before, and more effective at it, has been incredible. And we've also been working with different virtual aspects. So we're working on Hopin now. We worked on WebEx, Zoom. We used to use the Cisco service back in the day. And then one of the other modes, one that affects me personally, is the asynchronous modes. So when we went into lockdown in March, the physician assistant program, their clinical staff, or not their staff, their students beginning their clinical rounds, just stopped because you couldn't go into the hospital at that period. And these were just students. They were not at the medical professional level, so putting them in danger or putting them in situations that were at that time chaotic was not possible. So they had to switch the whole curriculum around, and then the faculty reached out to me to help develop this online tutorial course to help them with their capstone project. So basically, within a series of a couple of weeks, we put together research guides or lib guides, like the screenshot I have of the one here for their evidence-based medicine program, where they would have to research databases, build a search, evaluate the resources, and then come to a clinical conclusion based on those questions. Through this, they were able to do it at their own time, at their own pace, and we used a number of the resources, including our LibGuides and the LibWizard feature, to get some sort of accountability. This was a new mode that sort of appeared out of this new hybrid environment that we were working in. And we were able to get the entire class that had to do that big switch, get that entire class to go through the entire project, and then use the help of the library resources, also linking to our consultation page, which goes back to our reference. So everything sort of links together. Next slide, please. This is a fun one. This is where I get to use one of the library resources to demonstrate an impact. Okay, so I think we're going to use the chat in this part. So how many publications, I'd like to see how many guesses, how many publications did Rutgers scholars and researchers produce just in the year 2022? So just last year. I was going to use this year, but this year's only been around for 2.5 months. So how busy do you think Rutgers researchers were in 2002? Oh, wow. That's a bold number, Stephen Carter. Any other takers? Any other guesses? All right. So let's move on to the next one. Close, Stephen, but we have, there was a total of, keep forgetting the exact number, there was almost 7,750 publications in the year 2022. Now, with every single one of those publications, there has to be a list of references, correct? So where did they get those references? They were reading the full text, they got them through the library. So the impact, as you can see, when we went in, you can just see the sharp increase after 2020. The utilization of the library resource through the virtual realm increased a lot. And it was through these hybrid interactions, through reference interviews and instruction, that we were able to help the researchers achieve these goals. It's, as you can see, we just keep getting more and more involved in research, more successful publications, and at a greater rate. And the resource I used for this particular image is a library resource, Scopus, which can be used to find literature searching, but it can also be used for evaluating research and the impact of research. This is where, if you've done, you can check, I've forgotten, everybody here is at Rutgers. You can check your resources. You can actually look up yourself and see your impact, see how's it cited, look up your H index, see the length of the growth of the citations. It is a fascinating little tool that we have. All right, and on to the next slide, and I believe it's Naomi's up next.
Yes. Well, so going back to the various and really well-developed and robust ways we have for reaching our patrons, we reach them in the online environment before they've ever stepped into the library, which I find really very quite exciting, and I'm very enthusiastic about that reality. Next slide, please. The question is one of the most important questions that's been pursuing us since March of 2020. Can online instruction produce learning outcomes that match in-person learning? This question is going to be asked and explored for years to come. And the short answer is that we're really still in the midst of it. We're not able to form definitive conclusions. However, exploration is certainly already taking place, and there are a number of reasons to be optimistic. So, for example, a 2022 article describing a study that examined students' learning adjustment in an introductory statistics class, and this was in response to the challenges presented by COVID. It showed significant correlations in grades, page views, and on-time assignment submissions. And this study suggested that the in-person and online learning modalities were comparable. A number of other conclusions that, and I've cited here on this slide, are going to sound very familiar. So, for example, a diversity of learning methods in yet another online class really led to improved student learning outcomes. So, and we've seen this, and we really have known about this for years in the face-to-face environment. So what has been shown to be effective in one environment is also effective in the other. And it's also especially significant to note that teaching methods that incorporate active learning have been shown to produce more robust outcomes both in person and online. In fact, I just before this session, I sat in on a very interesting panel discussion conducted by a group of students who were discussing the ways in which are the methods by which they are motivated to be active in their online classes. And so online polls, for example, just to take one small example, the students were universally very responsive to and enthusiastic about that. So make no mistake, while remote learning presents challenges, it is entirely possible to incorporate active learning into online course delivery, to incorporate student-centered teaching practices into online delivery. Yet another session from this morning was titled How to Approach Asynchronous Video for Improved Engagement. I'll be most interested to tune into that recording. So I've come to think about the continuity that exists between online and in-person instruction in terms of the best practices that that carry over from the in-person to the online environment. So we can be translating that active learning, student-centered instruction practices into the online medium. Okay, and next slide, please. The enhancement of accessibility provided by remote services and instruction is very substantial. The term accessibility for me has started to tend to evoke thoughts of, I don't know, injury or illness or something unexpected and possibly unpleasant. But accessibility is a reality and a need that impacts all of us. So I've started to substitute the word accommodation rather than accommodation. I've tended to use the word adaptation because I feel as though adaptation is what we've been engaged in by necessity in a very intensive way over the past 3 years. So while accommodation and even accessibility implies an exception, something out of the ordinary, but the fact is that any one of us can be disabled at one time or another. If you've ever injured your ankle and found yourself hobbling around, anyone who's ever wheeled a baby carriage or a baby stroller around knows about the issues, very real issues that we take for granted around mobility. So any one of us can require what we still call accommodation or accessibility, but which I now prefer to call adaptation. More broadly, the enhanced accessibility to meetings and presentations, recordings of those, significantly improves truly equitable access for members of the RU community. For example, and this has been alluded to by my colleagues during this presentation, I can schedule one-on-one Zoom meetings in the evenings with advanced nursing students who are almost all involved during the day in clinical work. We're not limited to what used to be, traditional hours, sort of 9 to 5 hours. It's a very significant improvement for their accessibility to teaching and to consultations and the kind of instruction and assistance that they require for their very specific courses of study. I think you can go on to the next slide.
Oh, that's me. Back to me again. So as I mentioned earlier, my role at Rutgers is for special collections and audiovisual metadata. I'm not an archivist, but I have worked with special collections and archives for the entirety of my career. Our unique and distinct collections at Rutgers and everywhere are a very important part of academic libraries. That's what separates us from the collections at other institutions. They're a vital part of our connection with the university community, and they also connect us with researchers from across the globe. This is an area in particular that I think people have a difficult time separating from the idea of printed physical materials. But even here, we've been shifting to a hybrid environment for many years. In archives, maybe even more so than in the general collection, our researchers are global. For example, here at Rutgers, we have the most comprehensive jazz archive in the world, which has brought us jazz researchers from every continent, except Antarctica, I think. Someone will have to correct me if I'm wrong about that. We also have the unique William Elliott Griffiths collection, which highlights foreign policy and shared academics and research between the United States and Japan in the 19th century. Even our more local collections, like New Jersey history, Rutgers history, and the history of medicine in New Jersey, have brought us global connections. And these connections would be exceedingly difficult and expensive, if not impossible altogether, without remote services and resources. In archives, remote services and resources strengthen discovery and access. Our users can find our resources remotely, but not only that, they can also access many of them remotely when they're made available digitally. This allows us to reach more researchers, more students, more donors in more places at more times. Time zones aren't the barrier they once were, and miles or kilometers aren't the barriers they once were either. There's also a preservation component to digitizing special collections. If researchers can access a digital representation of an item, that helps to preserve the original item. Researchers ask for scans of physical items to be emailed to them all the time. One project we've been working on at Rutgers is to add these scanned resources to our online repository, RUCore, as they're requested. We do this because we know that if an item is requested once, it's likely to be requested again. So in reality, the way that happens, our archivists scan the item after a user asks for it, and they upload it to RUCore, the online repository. Then they reach out to me in technical services where I can add metadata to make it accessible digitally in the future. While librarians contribute service and scholarship, a large part of our role is actually management. And as the head of Central Technical Services, Mary Beth manages both support staff and 3 faculty librarians, including me. The shift to remote and hybrid libraries presented unique challenges, but also opportunities to management, which Mary Beth will share with you now.
Okay, thanks, Melissa. One key takeaway from the switch from in-person to working remotely is meetings. They take on an added significance in a hybrid environment. They actually are easier for us to schedule as well, because we don't have to worry about things like getting a meeting room. And they're easier to schedule, as I mentioned, because we can send a link with the time, the date, and any documentation. And that way you don't have people saying, I didn't get the handout, where is it? It's also less disruptive. You don't have people coming in, leaving. They can silently come in by Zoom, or they can silently leave by Zoom. Another thing that's important is trust is key. When we first started working remotely, when we got our staff together, and I mentioned during lockdown, we had some old timers who said they were very resistant, and they said, no, I want to work here. I want to come in. And I had to tell them, well, you can't. And this is why. They have now adapted really well to working hybrid. They love it. They're very good at pacing themselves, and their productivity is important. But trust is really important too. We don't have, in a hybrid environment or remote, we don't have the visual cues of seeing people come in or working at their desks. And there are more effective ways to supervise people than standing over them or them sitting at their desk. Instead, we set up productivity targets. When we first went to remote during lockdown, those productivity targets were not very detailed, because we honestly thought we would only be working at home for 2 weeks. Now they're much more detailed, and our employees, something they do that I really like is at the end of the day, they'll tell us what they've worked on, and at the end of the week, they give us a summary. So that way we have an idea what they're working on, what issues they might have, and where they're at with the work. Communication is very important too. Of course, we email, we do our Zoom meetings, but it's very important to continue an ongoing dialogue. There's nothing worse than having a supervisor who never asks you questions or doesn't check in with you. And those check-ins are good because they assure people that we care about them. We also know what's going on. Documentation is extremely important too in a hybrid environment. And moving to a hybrid environment has forced us to be better with documentation. In the past, people might have walked up to somebody and said, hey, I can't do this. Can I help you? And they can probably still do that by Zoom, but it's increased the importance of having good documentation and having it in a central location and keeping it updated. And also, because some of our employees were not very skilled at using technology in the beginning, we would have to go over some of that documentation with them. As I mentioned before, checking in and feedback are very important. When you do a performance review, particularly in this new environment, it's very important that you're honest and straightforward. There should be no surprises to people. And you should also cut them some slack if they are changing from working in a totally on-site environment to doing new things. Flexibility is also important. We have employees that they do elder care, they might do child care, they have a variety of challenges, and we have had to be flexible with them. Some of them like to start earlier, some of them start later in the day. So flexibility has been very important. The bottom line is, are they getting their work done and done in a timely fashion? That's the most important thing to us. Okay, and I think we can go to the next slide.
So we've all heard of the Great Resignation. Now, this, of course, has impacted many different fields, organizations, and the fact is that because now we've had over almost 3 years, 3 solid years of seeing just how much work can be done remotely, just how much can be accomplished remotely. There's really no going back in the minds of many, and now it's not just the minds of many, in practice, to an absolute requirement for 5 day a week, 9 to 5 in-person schedules. My colleague Mary Beth was talking about developing trust, and that's something that's had to happen in many industries, and it's certainly happened in our organization. In order to really be competitive in terms of both retention, faculty and staff retention and recruitment, we need to embed that hybrid flexibility into the way we structure our work. We need it just, very basically in order to maintain our workforce and in order to attract the best people for open positions. Just as importantly, this kind of hybrid environment, just as with some of the other types of services that I was describing earlier, enhances our equity in a very substantial way. It creates a welcoming environment for caregivers, for parents, for people who are caring for elderly relatives, for people whose mobility may be impaired in one way or another. They can continue to be every bit as much contributing members of our library community as those who are completely mobile, those who have no or few impediments of any kind, precisely because they're able to accomplish a great deal from wherever they may live. In addition, going back again to the issue of faculty retention and recruitment, or recruitment in particular, a flexible hybrid work environment allows us to cast a much broader net, or much wider net rather, and to pull from a broader geographic area from which to recruit. And I'm very confident that is also going to, going forward, enhance the body of individuals who work with the libraries. It can only enrich us. Next slide.
We're back to me. So as I mentioned earlier, Mary Beth and I co-authored a book, Virtual Technical Services, a Handbook, which focused on much of what we're presenting to you today, including remote management and faculty retention and recruitment. But we also wrote about the benefits of remote and hybrid work holistically, both to the individual employee and to the institution itself. For me, I have to say this was the most interesting part of our research, because it helped me to see how the way we work as individuals is connected to our own personal health, but also to the health and wellness of the institution as a whole. And guess what? If your employees are healthy and functional, then the research shows that your organization will also be healthy and functional. You can't have one without the other. The pandemic, as we know, was the social experiment that none of us ever asked for, but it allowed us to see how this shift in the way we worked impacted our results. A lot of focus has been placed on the negatives of that, on how our mental health was impacted by being cut off from seeing family and friends, and just from the overwhelming stress and threat to our health and public safety, just through living through a pandemic. But there were positives too that were important to apply to the way we work in the future. We're not going back to 2019 ever again, we know that, but we're also not going back to 2020 either. We're taking the lessons we learned from both to make a better future for ourselves. What the research shows is that when employees are given flexibility in their work, when they're allowed to work from home if they need to or want to, or if they're allowed to work on site if they need to or want to, that's what provides the best outcomes. The thing is, everyone is different. Some folks really do need that in-person human interaction, but not everyone does, and not everyone does all the time. This is why flexibility is key. When employees are given that flexibility, their measured impact and productivity, and this is across all fields and disciplines, increases. We've seen increased job satisfaction. If anyone from Rutgers attended the Future of Work listening sessions here last year, then you heard that coming through loud and clear. People just like working remotely. There's a quality of life issue with having the flexibility to schedule home repairs, medical appointments, or family obligations into our days without missing an entire day of work. For caregivers and for those with disabilities, We saw a huge increase in accessibility in the workplace, which we'd never seen before. In remote work, a lot of us found the freedom to do our jobs better than we'd ever been able to do before, because working from home gave us the accommodations or the adaptations, as Naomi suggested, that maybe we didn't even know we had, or we didn't even know we needed before we had them. We also saw a positive environmental impact with fewer commuting cars on the road, less emissions, less traffic, safer travels to and through campus. And overall, what we did not see was a decline in communication or connection. In fact, at the libraries, at least, I think we can all testify that working remotely brought us closer together than we had ever been. Until we were working remotely, I hadn't had a chance to work with Naomi or Matt, for example. And I think these connections have made us a stronger organization overall. This morning, we heard Dr. Benjamin in her keynote give an example of the spiked bench. And I think a lot of us didn't even see the spikes on the benches we were sitting on until they came down during the pandemic. But now that those spikes are down and we have a place where we can all sit comfortably, we're kind of realizing like, oh, it feels really good to be here. I can work with this. This is nice. And this is where I'm going to stop for questions. There are our names and email addresses. We do have about 10 minutes for questions, so that's good. And thank you. I'm going to stop sharing my screen because actually this whole time I haven't been able to see anyone. I've just been looking at my slides. So let me go back to the window, and there you are. Hello.
Hello.
Any comments are welcome as well. They don't have to just be questions.
Okay. Stephen Carter asks, what are future plans for existing physical libraries, i.e. plans to archive, warehouse more on-call books and converting prime real estate for other more collaborative spaces? Example, Alexander Hatchery.
I think he's already answered his question.
Mary Beth, you worked closely with the Hatchery. For anyone who doesn't know what it is, do you want to really quickly explain?
It is a collaborative learning environment in Alexander Library. It offers multimedia support. So it's not, when you think of a library, you don't just go and there's tables with books and things. This is where people can record things. They can go in small group areas and work. It's very nice, been nicely redesigned. And I believe a news crew recently filmed there.
Wow.
So
Wow.
for people who haven't been there, they can see it on television. I don't know what channel or what network it was.
And I have to say, where Naomi works in Newark, Dana Library, it looks beautiful now. They recently renovated.
Especially that third floor, which it's my own term, I call it the clubhouse. But of course, real work goes on there. But it's full of the kind of seating that really appeals to students. They gather there, they collaborate. It's also just aesthetically very pleasing, and it is always a buzz with activity, and it's very heartening to see.
But one thing that happened to make room for that renovation was a massive weeding project, where we deaccessioned books that weren't being used, moved them off site. We've been digitizing a lot of books through the Google Books project.
Yes.
Shifting to make room for what our users most need.
And I know at Camden, they are sharing their space with a public library and some offices on campus. So this is going back to Stephen's question. I won't be surprised more that happens. Of course, nobody consults us, so we don't know the long-term plans.
But whether we have physical spaces or not, I think what we learned during the pandemic is that our services don't stop.
Mm-hmm.
And our collections don't go away. If anything, they become more accessible to people.
And they're needed more than ever.
Right. As Matt showed, I love that data that you gathered for this, Matt. That showed we answered 7,000, we had 7,500.
Keep on publishing, and they get all their resources from us, hopefully.
and 72,000 reference questions in 3 years. I did the math in my head. It comes to over 100 questions a day.